thank you for coming along to this keynote session. It's great to see so many of you in the room. I'm Hazel Marshall. I'm a story consultant who works in the television industry and has done for the last couple of decades. And also I'm co-author, along with Katrina over here, of creating TV formats from inception to pitch. And actually, by coincidence, one of our interviewees is here today in that book. He was in that. But I'm delighted to be joined by Narinder Minhas, who I'll be talking to for about 30 minutes, and then we're hoping for lots of questions or thoughts or whatever from you as well. So Narinder is an award-winning executive producer and creative leader. With over 60 productions under his belt, he's delivered shows across all genres for the world's top broadcasters. Born in India, Narinder moved to Britain with his family when he was a child. He grew up in a working-class community in southeast London, where Punjabi was the main language. His varied career has seen him move from executive positions at the BBC, working on blue-chip and popular series like Panorama and The Money Programme, to Channel 4, where he became a commissioning editor, as well as then into senior roles in the independent sector, where he helped build super brand companies, as well as making award-winning content. As a programme maker, Narinder's produced a huge range of critically acclaimed and popular shows, from the heart-wrenching Peter, the human cyborg for Channel 4, to the provocative We Are Black and British for the BBC, and the groundbreaking White Tribe, also for Channel 4. That's just to name a few. Narinder's also worked with a broad mix of high-profile individuals, from Noam Chomsky to Francis Fukuyama, Nigella Lawson, Andrew Marr, Chan France, Bill Clinton, and ZZ Mills. He's passionate about television, film, education, and the arts. And Narinder is also an honorary research fellow at his alma mater at the University of Exeter and a member of BAFTA. Right now, he's also the CEO of Cardiff Productions. And before we get started on the discussion, we're going to show a reel of their recent productions, many of which highlight some of the topics that we'll be talking about today.
Just because we're all from the black community doesn't mean we all think the same.
I don't believe in systemic racism.
That is a dangerously racist idea that you are perpetuating that makes our lives harder.
This is what we have to go through as black people, and then the police system wonder why black people have no faith in the justice system.
Tonight on Unapologetic, it's all about sex.
I love it.
Thank you. What if the boo said, yo, babes, how about we just try a thing like open relationship style?
I would vomit. I would vomit in my hands and I would...
His grandmother compared me to the color of a paper bag and said that I was too dark chocolate for him, and he couldn't date me. And I said, what the hell?
It was, without a doubt, the moment that made it so clear to me, I've got to do something about my skin color. If I don't do something to be less Asian, they're gonna kill me.
I had never seen black, queer people take up space in that way before.
O blaen, o'n i'n edrych yn yr drych, ac o'n i'n gweld fi fy hun, o'n i'n gweld rhyw berson diarth, o'n i'n nabod.
I'm bisexual, you know.
Mam bach, be dwi'n neud?
Jasmine, God love her, she's gone through the mud and she doesn't want to get mud on her boots.
So how did it go not getting muddy?
Well, it didn't go very well, did it?
And I really can feel it standing here. I am at the very start point of Britain's longest river.
Doesn't get much better than this, Richard. This is just awesome.
I didn't do the strike thing until too late, and then it...
an amazing range of programmes there. Narinder, you've been in the industry for a while, but I'd really like to start with how you actually got started in it in the first place.
Well, it goes back a long way to the last century. I sort of knew towards the end of my uni experience, and I wanted to go into the media, but I didn't really know how to do it. So I just wrote, and I've got a record of this actually. I wrote 280 odd letters in the days when you wrote letters, by the way, and it wasn't on email. And I got one reply, and I got invited to an interview, actually. It was with an ITV company called London Weekend Television. And I did a really bad interview, really, really bad. But there was one guy, and it was really incredibly intimidating. You can imagine, you know, being 22 years old and 5 blokes, and they were all blokes, actually. They were all white, and I was there in this room. But one guy obviously took a shine, and he said straight after the interview, I don't think you're going to get this job. You're incredibly gauche and awkward, and did you know you didn't look at anyone in the eye? I, of course, haven't noticed any of this, actually. And he said, have you ever thought about doing drama? Something that involved performance, because it might just help loosen up your body. And I was like, this is really weird. So I kind of took it on board, and I thought, actually, maybe I was rubbish. You know, you can imagine growing up in a working class community, even going to university. You're pretty rough, actually, at the age of 22. You're not polished. You don't know how the system works. You've got no social skills. And, you know, there are obviously people out there who, from the age of whatever, really, had grown up in an environment where they were able to do small talk and all that sort of stuff. Anyway, so I did decide to do some drama. I couldn't find anything that was a drama course, but what I did find was a 10-week mime course. So I started to... Anyway, I did this thing, and I took it really, really seriously. A year later, I applied for the same job. This time I got it. I'm not saying that my mime skills got me the job, but clearly the interview was a lot better. But anyway, during that period, he told me to carry on working for this local paper, which I was working on, and that's how I started. But it was brutal, getting all those rejections. And in some ways, I don't think it's any easier now, actually. I mean, yesterday in Broadcast Magazine, which is the trade magazine, 3/4 of freelancers are unemployed at the moment. It's almost like a sort of existential crisis in television. There's a deeper issue around the model, actually, the economic model, which maybe we'll touch on in other sessions, but it's incredibly worrying. So it feels like we are going through a lot of change. Anyway, that's how Hazel, I got in. But I just want to talk about something actually, which during that period I did read quite an interesting book written by a guy called Dilip Hero, who's I don't know if he's still alive actually, but he was an academic, and he said that there are 2 options for sort of relatively like smart Asian black kids. You either become an academic or you become a journalist. And in some ways what he was saying was that the best way forward is to monetize being an outsider, is to use that I as someone who's, you know, and I obviously didn't grow up when I was a kid in this country, came here when I was young. That idea of constantly being an outsider in that room where I was interviewed by those people, but being an outsider in general, lends itself to those professions. I decided against academia, I'm afraid, guys, but I'm sorry. But I did go to television and journalism, so that's how it all started.
And I think that's a really key point, I think, about getting into the industry, because it's never easy, and now it is more challenging than ever. but actually the key thing is not even getting into it, it's staying in it for all those reasons. And we will touch on them as we go through, and again, if there's any questions towards the end, because that kind of starts to feed into almost a bit of a narrowing of what you then get. But let's broaden it a little bit first by going back to Cardiff Productions. So as we saw from your show reel, there's an amazing range of shows there, and your kind of brand is that you are popular, bold and diverse. So why those three words?
Yeah, I think when we set up the company, which is right at the beginning of lockdown, we did play that sort of game of trying to work out what the brand is. I mean, diverse is pretty obvious from the way I've described being an outsider. Also, to be honest, if you've grown up here being an outsider, it's such an important issue, really. But I mean diverse in its broadest sense. I don't just mean in terms of like race, gender. I also mean diverse in thought, diverse in content, which often gets neglected when we're talking about diversity. We start to just think about jobs, or we start to think about representation. I think diversity of content is equally important. And so, yeah, I think that explains the diverse bit. The popular bit, I don't really want to make niche programming. I don't really want to talk to just a few people. I'm trying to sort of connect with a much wider audience. And I love it when people talk about your shows. I love it. And you know, I mean, the classic thing as a program maker is watch the program going out and be on Twitter and watch the reaction. That is thrilling, actually, when people tell you nice things. Less thrilling when they tell you horrible things, but it's there and it's very immediate. Bold, I think that this is really, really important part of the brand, actually. I mean, a lot of my output has been quite provocative or edgy, and I think that even if you're making a popular format for BBC One, say, just to bear in mind that what might make it a bit more interesting is something bold within it. That can either be in terms of its form, its structure, its sort of shape, or it can be actually in terms of its kind of content. So bold is really important, actually.
Yeah, I think bold and popular are really key, because there is, you know, that thing about you can end up just being in a niche, just serving people who are already interested in what you're looking at, and the idea presumably is to broaden the conversation.
It is. I mean, I think when you're talking about making programs about race, I think it's really important to engage the white audience, really. I mean, what is the point in just talking to ourselves? So I think in all the shows that we do, we try and engage a much wider audience and try and find those topics within those programs that will resonate really across the country. And I always have a picture of some, I don't know why, Harrogate, actually. It's partly because we filmed there. It's probably, I think we checked out in the stats, it's like one of the whitest places in Britain. So I always have somebody in Harrogate in my head whenever I make a program. Because I think if I can attract that audience, if I can find something within the subject matter that will appeal to a place that's not really going to normally be the place you'd be targeting, then I think I'll have achieved something.
Yeah, I just want to dive a little bit more into the diversity info, because when we've spoken before, you've broken it down into three different categories. I wonder if you could talk about that and how you think the industry is doing with each of them at the moment.
Yeah, for me, there are three very distinct categories when we talk about diversity in television. One is representation, which is what's happening on the screen. And there's a spectrum from purely just the sort of numbers game. I don't know, a program like Escape to the Country just happens to have an Asian family in it. You're not really going to talk to them about their race, you're not really going to talk to them about their background, you're not really going to talk to them about any of the issues, really. But they just happen to be there because they're buying a property, and you just need to see some kind of representation. All the way across to where actually the storylines are sort of just beginning to be important in terms of people's backgrounds or cultures being represented. So that's representation. And then what's happening behind the camera, I think, is distinct again, which is really largely about jobs. And here, it's quite complicated, I would say. I think there are sort of bottlenecks in particular areas. I think in some areas we're really making big strides. And then there's this third category, which gets conflated with the other two, which is diversity of content, which is really about what is the subject matter, how important is the diverse subject matter in this programme. And I would say all our shows, whether they're bold, popular or diverse, try and deal with all three issues. Sometimes we're more successful than other times, but essentially that's our aim. So just to go back to in terms of those three separate areas, how well is television doing? I would say on representation, pure representation, just in terms of numbers, I would say that's definitely improving. And in some ways we've overcorrected, I would say, in terms of the last 2-3 years post Black Lives Matter. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it, when you watch live television, which a lot of us don't, but when you do and you see ads, you realise in every single corporation is so desperate to have representation that you sometimes imagine that a country may have a lot more brown and black people than it actually does. I mean, if you go back to the sort of populations, we're only talking about under 4% of Britain is black, 10% is South Asian. So I'd say in terms of representation, just in pure numbers, television's making big strides. But in some ways, it's low-hanging fruit. It's the easiest diversity to sort of fix because it doesn't really challenge power, it doesn't challenge anything really. It's there. Behind the camera, I think we've got huge problems. I would say broadly, entry level has become more diversified. And again, that's one of the easier fixes, really. But as you go up the food chain, I think that's where the sort of problems arise. I mean, I still don't think there's enough female directors out there, and it's actually terrible, I think, in certain genres like documentary, maybe in lifestyle programming, it may be a bit easier. And obviously there are good stories here in terms of gender. I mean, I think the BBC's made amazing strides here. If you look at some of the senior management, it's not in bad shape. I'd say in terms of race, behind the camera, I would say, again, at entry level, things have improved, but higher up, it's pretty bleak, actually. What's that expression about snow peaks? Yeah, I think it applies. I'd say content, diversity of content, making programs like We Are Black and British, which you saw in there, that's harder. Particularly getting them out in prime time is much harder now, because in my view, what's happened, certainly in the last 20 years, and it was a big change actually with Ofcom in the early noughties, where Ofcom changed its remit, it dropped religion, it watered down its educational commitments, and there was a general sort of watering down. I think it was 2003. I think what's happened since then is that we've seen television retreat into a certain number of territories, content territories like property, like cooking, whatever. I mean, you can name them. And so we've sort of narrowed in terms of our content. And so it's much harder to offer commissioning editors something very new in that sort of landscape. But I keep trying. I'll carry on trying. But I think the trick is to find something that's very broad as a way in. Unless you have these moments like Black Lives Matter where suddenly it reaches national consciousness, in which case it becomes a lot easier. And We Are Black and British was born out of that sort of period where it's a way of looking at the black community and actually saying, you know what, you thought it was homogenous, or by and large it's generalised to be homogenous, it's not. And interestingly, it came from a chat with an academic 3 years ago who told me a lot of black people voted Brexit, which I thought, wow, no one's really reported on that, no one's really explored that. I had no idea really myself that actually there was a lot of right-wing black people in the country, as there are right-wing Asian people. But it's very interesting how in the 3 years that issue has now become obviously prevalent. So that's a long-winded way of saying we're making some strides and it's great in certain areas, but actually there's still a long way to go.
And we haven't even touched on class or anything, but we're very aware that is another area.
Yeah.
Within the industry, and all these things, of course, are quite intersectional. They'll, and in challenging times like we have just now, it becomes even more difficult. But let me just broaden it out even further. Although interestingly, you talk about the fact that we're narrowing around it, but let's talk about how technology has had an effect as well, because that's changed the industry quite a lot since you've been in.
It has. I mean, and this is gross generalisation. I think that what's happened in television is that we've become less obsessed about content and more obsessed about form. If the number of territories retreats, how do you distinguish between programs? How do you distinguish between one property show from another one? You start to play with its form much more. You start to design formats and shapes and structures that are very, very different and distinct. So one way into being more playful with form is technology. And we are going to go through probably a revolution in this respect when it comes to AI. But just to go back in time and show you how important technology is. So the Rig show, so One Born Every Minute, and all those kind of programs where people have stuck little cameras into environments, have produced hundreds of programs actually. So that was like a quantum leap really in form. You know, somebody come up with the idea of having a Rig show.
And probably less than a decade ago, or around a decade ago?
Yeah, maybe, I'm not quite sure on when it came about, but Big Brother was obviously an early example of that. But then we just had a spawning of this, the Rig, if you like. I think that we'll see now, and I think AI might be another one of these big moments. But there's still sort of last century technologies which I think will still creep into television. So I think body cams, I noticed that GPS devices have become more and more sophisticated, and without sort of going into how we develop programs at Cardiff, but I've been banging on in the last couple of years about rat cam as an idea. So basically, can we put GPS devices under the skin of rats and have lots of cameras? So the idea was actually to take a student house, sorry about this guys, and put 20 rats in the house, and rig the house and follow what happens to the rats, and actually give them names as well, which I thought would be cute. Anyway, so I think there's still a lot to do with the old technology. In terms of new technology, AI, well, I think it's very interesting. I think the Americans are much more advanced here in different ways. Somebody told me that there are AI-specific jobs within production companies in America, which I think is really, really interesting. It shows you that AI is being incorporated into production companies. In Britain, we're not there yet, but I think people are going to start to think about actually having job titles where AI is significant. And AI is significant in two broad aspects. It's significant in terms of jobs within production companies. We're not just making television programs, there's a finance department, there's all sorts of, there's HR and all that sort of stuff. So maybe AI may have an impact in those areas, it probably will. On the creative bit, I think AI will have an impact, actually. I even think the generation of ideas fact, I did this. I asked. So one of the common techniques in development, which Hazel will be familiar with, is that you reverse the process of how you come up with a television idea. Often you come up with the content and then you say, okay, guys, got the content, but what are we going to call it? And you come up with a title. What if you just simply reversed that and said, here's a title, what's the content? So one way we try and do that in our development team brainstorming is we just say, okay, let's take a Beatles track, whatever Beatles track you want to choose, then just say, what would the content be if that was the title of the song and it went out on Channel 4? So I, this weekend, asked ChatGPT, here's a title, can you please come up with some content? I've got a meeting coming up with Channel 4 next week. So ChatGPT, in the space of 3 seconds or whatever it was, gave me a whole list of ideas. And actually, most of them rubbish, but there were like 2 which I thought the beginnings of a conversation. So I think in brainstorming and in that simple thing where you just need some lateral thoughts thrown into a meeting, AI is actually quite interesting. And I'm not saying it's going to come up with brilliant ideas, but eventually it might, actually, who knows? But at this stage, it's actually contributing to the process of development. So I'm definitely going to use it. I'm definitely going to have it as part of our development team stuff. Yeah. In terms of like video, I would say archive is going to get transformed. So we've already seen black and white archive colorized, which, if you like, sort of beginnings of that sort of process. I saw somebody show me a clip of how if you take a sort of 2-dimensional picture, if you take a photograph, an ordinary photograph, say we took a photograph of Winston Churchill, we can actually cut through the AI system to a piece of video which is a 360-degree shot of Winston Churchill standing in a room, and I have to say it looks pretty good. Looks pretty amazing. So I think archive programming, which has become actually quite popular during lockdown, partly because we have a sort of, I think in moments of crisis we have a sort of nostalgia about what happened in Britain. And anyway, archive, I think, will get transformed.
I would agree with that. I think archive is, it's the last decade again, it's another genre that's really come up. I have lots of questions that I can still ask, but I'm aware of time, and I really want to hear, because I know we've got lots of really interesting people who are doing fascinating papers in the room. So does anyone have any questions for Narinder, or anything they want to share around what we're talking about? There's one up here. Is there, do we have a mic? Or? Just try. Yeah.
I was just wondering, how do you think AI is going to help the crisis of employment of freelancers? It could be an argument that AI is really not going to help. But I'm interested in your perspective.
I'm an optimist when it comes to technology, actually. It's partly because I did a program once, which is called The End, which was written, it was a book written by a guy called Jeremy Rifkin, who's a academic stroke consultant figure, who wrote a book called The End of Work. And actually it's rubbish. Works, it's like, he made a lot of money out of this book, and it's an interesting book, and it's got some interesting arguments. In the end, I do think jobs, there will be jobs, but there'll be different jobs. And I don't believe that jobs just disappear. I think that they get transformed, really. And in America, as I was saying, we're seeing jobs that involve AI in their title. So I'm optimistic, actually. I'm optimistic that we will get rid of some of the boring jobs and replace them with some of the more interesting jobs. But I'm not saying that some jobs might not disappear as part of the process. The question of the 3/4 of freelancers being unemployed at the moment, I think is a separate thing. I think there are bigger threats than AI. I think our financial model for some of the broadcasters needs to be looked at. Channel 4 is incredibly dependent on ad funding, and ad funding is changing and morphing into all sorts of things. You know, we've moved from a world where we had 3 or 4 channels to a world where there's multi-channels, and the advertisers are spreading their money across all these different outlets. And for Channel 4, just to be dependent on ad funding, by and large, is incredibly risky and difficult. And right now, they're not commissioning anything, actually. And as a company and as somebody who works as an indie producer, you know, it's a great place to work for. I love Channel 4. I work there myself. And I think it's been a very rocky year for them, and I'm incredibly worried about what's going to happen to them next year.
Thank you. Any other questions? Oh, there's one just in the middle in the white shirt. Yep, you may have to speak up.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good question, actually. So Cardiff Productions is a mixed economy of shows that are unashamedly populist, if you like, at one end of the spectrum, and at the other end, programs that are probably not going to get massive viewers, but actually are potentially winning you awards, potentially getting you noticed more. So I think it's impossible to survive as a production company just to be making programs that are very niche, unless you've got a structure which has got very low costs, or you literally are doing everything, really. And there are lots of companies like that, just 2 people, who shoot their stuff, edit their stuff, get it commissioned, and probably they make 2 films a year. I didn't really want to do that. I wanted to create a brand, and I wanted to do something that's much bigger, on a bigger scale. And if you're going to do that, you have to be commercial. And I don't think being commercial is a dirty word. I think what I've tried to do in my career is to combine that with something that says something. I don't know. I think it's. Yeah, I mean, my mantra is that when I make television programs, I either want to make, ideally you want to do all 4 things: make people think, make people laugh, make people. I can't even remember my thing actually, but anyway, make people laugh, make people think, make people cry, actually. And then I think if I can remember the 4th one, I will, and I'll tell you in a minute. But essentially, those are the 4 values that I hold when I'm coming up with ideas. The hardest one is to make people laugh. It's really, really easy to be serious in television, and I think I'm not really interested in programs that just do that. Because that's easy, really. You may as well read an article. You may as well just go and Google it or whatever. But if you can make a show that can do a range of things and has a range of tones, brilliant. So I even the commercial shows, for me, have those values in them.
Sorry. Oh, sorry.
Very briefly, do you think the BBC is about to reduce in size in the coming years or not?
Gosh, I spent 9 years inside the BBC, and it felt very big and bloated, and there were lots of jobs inside. I think it has been slimming down, actually, and I think the big thing will be the decision around the licence fee. So and that is ultimately about who's in power, actually. So if the Conservatives stay in power, then I think the licence fee is under threat. It may not disappear completely, but it might get shared out in which case we will have a reduced BBC.
Thank you so much for such a beautiful discussion and reflection. So that's the first thing I want to say thank you to both of you. And then I'd just like to ask you a question about the reality genre, if I can. So reality genre is close to my heart, and it's something I've worked on since the 90s. And I've noticed that it's so influential to a lot of new genres on YouTube or TikTok, for example. I mean, recently I was looking at TikToks of her death trial, memes and TikToks around it. It's so out of the reality genre playbook in all sorts of problematic ways. Where do you see the reality genre influencing these kind of trending genres on YouTube and TikTok? And how do you see yourself and your wonderful work making an impact there?
Well, I think it is a powerful genre really within sort of documentary or factual entertainment space. I've embraced it, but I've tried to embrace it in the way that I've just been describing in the last sort of half hour or so, really, which is to find something distinct, find something that has a little bit of an edge. So We Are Black and British was a reality show. It was 6 black people in a house. So it was a sort of mini version of Big Brother, if you like. But I wanted to use that structure or that form and apply it to a different subject. So I can see that there may be a whole host of subjects that the reality genre will still move into and redevelop or whatever. But obviously the grammar of reality formats and shows is definitely going to be spreading across all sorts of short form content that you've described. So I think it's here to stay. I mean, it's so powerful. I watch a lot of Made in Chelsea with my daughter and all those shows. By the way, I really hate Made in Chelsea, but I'm trying to bond with my daughter, so I think it's the least I could do actually is to sit through an episode or two. But you know, Married at First Sight, Australia. Did anybody see that? Oh my God! I mean, it was extraordinary. So I think it's so powerful. It's so addictive. So I can see its grammar being used in all sorts of ways.
Yeah, we've got time for one last quick question.
You mentioned, Ray, that Channel 4 is struggling because of pressures on advertising, and we know that the current administration has toyed with the idea of changing its publisher-broadcaster status. Just wondered how important do you think it is in terms of, sustaining diversity of voices and content, and to have a continuation of the current system of supports, including Channel 4's role in commissioning content, but in particular retaining ownership of rights or protection for ownership of rights for indie producers like yourselves?
Yeah, I think there's two separate things in there. One is about IP and what happens to IP, whether the indie producer retains that or whether Channel 4 should have a slice of that. But the other point was really about the model, how it impacts diversity of thought really going forward. I mean, most of the interesting stuff I've made, and certainly most of the edgier stuff and the more controversial stuff I've made has been for either the BBC or Channel 4. So those institutions have particular models. And in my view, it would have been impossible to make those in the pure commercial sector. They would not have done it. I mean, We Are Black and British went out on the BBC, and I don't think, apart from Channel 4, anywhere else I could have taken that. So it worries me if the model changes and becomes more commercial in any way. So if Channel 4 has to become more commercial for whatever reason, I think diversity of thought and diversity of content starts to retreat, starts to disappear, and that's the thing I sort of struggle with and have sleepless nights about.
Yeah, which takes us back to where we started, really, in that whole sense. But unfortunately, we are now out of time, and while I'd love to carry on talking, we have to draw to a close. So I'd just like to ask you to join me in thanking Narinder.